The explosion ripped through the hull of the Harbinger like a hot knife through butter, and Commander Marcus Cole felt the entire ship shudder beneath his feet as alarms screamed through every corridor. He had been in the mess hall when the first blast hit, and now he was running through smoke and fire while the screams of his crew echoed all around him. "All hands abandon ship." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom before cutting off with a horrible static burst that told Marcus everything he needed to know about the bridge. The Chiron had come out of nowhere, and their fleet had surrounded the Harbinger before anyone could even sound a warning. Marcus had served in the Human Defense Force for 15 years, and he had fought against pirates and rebels and all manner of threats, but he had never seen anything like this. The Chiron were supposed to be their allies, or at least that was what the diplomats had promised when they arranged this peace mission. Now those same allies were tearing the ship apart piece by piece. Marcus ducked under a falling beam and rolled through a doorway just as another explosion sent flames roaring down the corridor behind him. His suit was damaged, and the life support was flickering in and out, and he knew he had maybe 20 minutes of air left if he was lucky. Smart thing to do was find an escape pod and get off this dying ship as fast as possible. But then he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was a sound he recognized instantly, even though he had never heard it from this particular species before. Is the sound of children crying. Marcus turned toward the noise, and his heart sank when he realized it was coming from the diplomatic wing. That part of the ship had taken heavy damage, and the hull was already starting to buckle under the pressure of the void outside. Every instinct told him to run the other way, but his feet carried him forward anyway. He found them in what used to be the ambassadors' quarters. Two young Chiron huddled together beneath a collapsed section of the ceiling, and their compound eyes were wide with terror as they clung to each other. Marcus recognized them immediately. Princess Sithara and Princess Velketh were the daughters of Queen Silthares herself, and they had been sent aboard the Harbinger as a gesture of good faith during the peace negotiations. They were supposed to be proof that the Chiron wanted friendship with humanity. Now they were trapped on a dying human ship while their own people blasted it to pieces. The older one saw Marcus and raised her small blade arms in a defensive posture, while making a high-pitched hissing sound that he assumed was a threat. She was maybe the equivalent of a human 12-year-old, and she was trying to protect her younger sister with everything she had. "Easy," Marcus said, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The younger princess was maybe 8 in human terms, and she was trembling so hard that her iridescent carapace rattled against the metal floor. She did not understand his words, but she understood his tone, and her crying softened just a little. Another explosion rocked the ship, and Marcus heard the horrible groan of metal giving way somewhere nearby. They had minutes at best. "We need to move," he said, and he slowly reached toward the debris pinning them down. "I am going to get you out of here, okay?" Sithara hissed again, but she did not strike at him as he began pulling away the wreckage. The metal was hot, and it burned his hands through his damaged gloves, but he kept working until both princesses were free. Velketh immediately scrambled behind her sister, and Sithara stood between Marcus and her sibling with her blade arms still raised. "The escape pods are this way," Marcus said, pointing down the corridor. "We need to go now." He did not wait for them to understand. He simply turned and started walking, and after a moment he heard the clicking of their legs following behind him. The journey to the escape pod bay was a nightmare of fire and destruction, and twice Marcus had to carry Velketh over gaps in the floor where the metal had been torn away by explosions. Sithar watched him the whole time with those unreadable compound eyes, and every time he touched her sister, she tensed like she was ready to attack, but she never did. They reached the escape pod bay to find most of the pods already gone or destroyed. Only one remained intact, and it was designed for a single human occupant. Marcus looked at the pod, and then looked at the two young aliens behind him. Math was simple. The pod had enough air and supplies for one person for about 30 days, with 3 of them crammed inside those. Supplies would run out much faster, and even if they survived, the Karen fleet would probably blast them out of the sky the moment they launched. But what choice did he have? He could leave the princesses here to die on the Harbinger. He could take the pod for himself and give himself the best chance of survival, or he could try to save all 3 of them and probably die anyway. Marcus thought about his crew and all the friends he had lost in the last hour. He thought about how the Chiron had betrayed them and murdered innocent people without warning or mercy. These were the children of the Queen who had ordered that attack. A darker man might have seen them as enemies. A crueler man might have seen them as leverage. But Marcus Cole looked at Sithara standing guard over her terrified little sister, and all he saw were 2 scared kids who needed help. "Get in," he said, opening the pod door. Sithara hesitated, and for a moment Marcus thought she might refuse. Then Velkith tugged at her sister's arm and made a soft pleading sound, and Sithara's resolve crumbled. She picked up her little sister and climbed into the pod. Marcus squeezed in after them, and the fit was impossibly tight, with barely enough room for all 3 of them to breathe. He sealed the door and punched the launch sequence, and the pod shot away from the Harbinger. Just as the ship's reactor finally gave out, explosion lit up the void like a small sun, and Marcus watched through the tiny viewport as everything he had known was consumed by fire. They were alone now, 1 human and 2 alien princesses, drifting through the endless black with limited supplies and no rescue coming. Marcus looked at the 2 young Chiron pressed against him in the cramped spacey Tira, was still watching him with suspicion and fear, but Velkith had fallen into an exhausted sleep with her small head resting against his arm. He did not know if he had made the right choice. He did not know if any of them would survive. But he knew that he could not have lived with himself if he had left 2 children to die alone in the dark. That was not who he was. That was not what humans did. And so Commander Marcus Cole closed his eyes and began to pray to whatever gods might be listening that he had not just doomed them all. The first 3 days were the hardest because the princesses would not eat, and Sithara would not lower her blade arms for even a moment. Marcus understood their fear, and he could not blame them for it. Them he was the enemy, and they were trapped in a tiny metal box with no way to escape from him. He tried speaking to them in a calm and gentle voice, but they did not understand his words, and his attempts at sign language only seemed to confuse them more. On the 2nd day, Velkith began to cry from hunger, but she still refused to touch the ration bars Marcus offered her. Older sister hissed and clicked her mandibles whenever he came too close, and Marcus knew that if he pushed too hard, Sithara might actually attack him out of desperation. So he did the only thing he could think of. He ate one of the ration bars himself while they watched. Then he broke another bar into small pieces and placed them on the floor between himself and the princesses before moving as far away as the cramped pod would allow. For a long time, nothing happened. Then Velkith reached out with one trembling claw and grabbed a piece. She sniffed it carefully before putting it in her mouth, and her compound eyes went wide with something that might have been surprised. The ration bars were designed for humans, and Marcus had no idea if they were even safe for Karen to eat. But when Velkith did not immediately get sick, her sister finally gave in and began to eat as well. It was a small victory, but it was enough. On the 4th day, the pod's heating system began to fail. Marcus could see his breath forming clouds in the cold air, and the 2 young Chiron were shivering so hard that their carapaces clicked together like chattering teeth. Had one thermal blanket, and it was barely big enough to cover himself. Without hesitation, he wrapped it around both princesses and tucked the edges under their bodies to trap whatever warmth he could see. Sithara looked at him with those unreadable eyes, and for the first time she lowered her blade arms. "Why?" she asked in broken and halting human speech. Marcus was so surprised to hear her speak his language that he almost did not answer. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Sithara tilted her head. In a gesture he was learning meant confusion. "Ambassador teach," she said slowly. "Little words only." Marcus nodded and pointed at the blanket wrapped around her and her sister. "You were cold," he said, speaking slowly so she could understand. "The blanket helps." "But you," Sithara said, gesturing at his shivering body. "You cold also." Marcus shrugged and tried to smile even though his lips were turning blue. "I will be fine," he lied. "Humans are tough." Sithara did not look convinced, but she did not argue. She simply pulled Velketh closer and watched Marcus through the long cold hours that followed on the 12th day. Marcus woke up to find both princesses pressed against his sides with the thermal blanket stretched over all three of them. Sithara was still awake and watching him, but she did not move away when their eyes met. "Body heat," she said, as if explaining her decision. "Mother teaches this for survival." Marcus wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all here. He was sharing warmth with the daughters of the queen, whose fleet had killed his entire crew. The heat from their small bodies was keeping him alive, and he was in no position to refuse their help. "Thank you," he said quietly. Syra nodded and closed her eyes, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus saw her truly relax. The days that followed were a slow education for all of them. Marcus learned that Chiron young needed to eat more often than human adults, but in smaller portions, so he adjusted the rationing accordingly. He learned that they could not drink plain water and needed it mixed with certain minerals from the medical kit to survive. He learned that Velketh loved to hear him talk, even though she could not understand most of his words, and that Sithara was endlessly curious about human customs and beliefs. In turn, the princesses learned that this strange soft creature was not their enemy. They learned that he would give up his own food to make sure they were fed. They learned that he would shiver through the night so they could be warm. They learned that he would tell them stories in his strange alien tongue just to hear. Velketh laughed. On the 20th day, Sithara asked him the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment he saved them. "Why save us?" she asked, and her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her confusion. "We are Chiron, and your people and our people are enemies now." Marcus thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Where I come from," he said slowly, "we believe that children are sacred." Sithara tilted her head again. "Sacred," she repeated, testing the unfamiliar word. "What means sacred?" "It means precious," Marcus explained. "It means protected, and it means that no matter what happens between adults, we do not hurt children, and we do not leave them to die if we can save them." Sithara was quiet for a moment. "Even children of enemies?" she asked. "Even children of enemies," Marcus confirmed. "Even if saving them costs us everything." Sithara reached out and placed one small claw on his hand. It was a gesture Marcus had never seen a Chiron make before, and he did not know what it meant, but the look in her eyes told him it was something important. "This is human way?" she asked softly. "This is human way," Marcus agreed. Sithara nodded and squeezed his hand gently. "Then humans are not what Mother told us," she said. "Mother says humans are weak and foolish and will be conquered easily." Marcus smiled despite the grim situation. "What do you think now?" He asked. Sithara looked at her sleeping sister, and then back at the battered and half-frozen human who had given everything to keep them alive. "I think Mother was wrong," she said. In the 33rd day, the pod's emergency beacon finally received a response. A Chiron patrol had detected their signal and was moving to intercept. Sithara's face lit up with hope, but Marcus felt only a cold certainty settling in his chest. "They will kill you," Sithara said. For the first time, her voice trembled with something like fear. "When they find a human in this pod, they will not listen." Marcus knew she was right. The Chiron were not known for their mercy, especially not toward humans, but he had come too far and sacrificed too much to let fear stop him now. "Then I will die knowing I did the right thing," he said calmly. and you will go home to your mother." Sithara gripped his hand hard enough to leave marks. "No," she said fiercely. "I will not let them." Marcus was touched by her loyalty, but he knew the reality of their situation. A princess could not protect a human from an entire Karen patrol. "You are children," he said gently. "You cannot fight your own people for my sake." Sithara lifted her chin with a pride that reminded him just whose daughter she was. "I am daughter of Queen Siltharix," she said. "My word is power even if I'm young." Marcus did not have the heart to argue with her. He simply squeezed her hand and watched through the viewport. As the Chiron ship grew larger against the stars, whatever happened next was out of his control. All he could do now was trust that the bond they had formed over these 40 days in the void meant something, and hope that the queen who had ordered the destruction of his ship still loved her daughters enough to listen. The Chiron patrol ship swallowed their tiny escape pod like a great beast devouring its prey, and Marcus felt his heart pounding against his ribs as the docking clamps locked into place. Airlock hissed open, and a dozen armored Chiron warriors stormed inside with their plasma lances raised and ready to fire when they saw Marcus sitting among their princesses. The lead warrior let out a roar of pure rage and struck him across the face with an armored fist. Marcus hit the wall hard and tasted blood, but he did not fight back. "Stop!" Sithara screamed in her native tongue. "He saved us, and you will not harm him." But the warriors were not listening to a child, even a princess. They dragged Marcus out of the pod and threw him to the deck while Sithara shouted and Velketh cried, and the whole scene dissolved into chaos. One of the warriors pressed a blade to Marcus's throat, and he was certain that his life was about to end. Then a calm and commanding voice cut through the noise. "Enough." The warrior with the blade froze and slowly stepped back. A Chiron officer approached, and her carapace was marked with the symbols of high rank that Marcus recognized from his military training. She looked down at him with cold, calculating eyes before turning to Sithara. "Princess," she said with a respectful bow, "you and your sister will be taken to comfortable quarters immediately, and a medical team will examine you." "And the human?" Sithara demanded. The officer glanced at Marcus with obvious disgust. "He will be detained and interrogated," she said, "and then he will face justice for the crimes of his species." "He committed no crimes," Sithara argued. "He saved our lives." "That will be for the queen to decide," the officer replied, and her tone made it clear that the conversation was over. Marcus was dragged away in chains, while Sithara's protests echoed behind him. He did not see the princesses again for many days. The Chiron kept him in a small dark cell with no windows and no furniture, except a hard metal bench that served as his bed. They gave him water, but barely enough food to survive, and the guards who brought his meals made sure to tell him in great detail what was going to happen when they reached the throne world. "Queen Siltharax will tear you apart with her own claws," one guard said with obvious pleasure. "She has killed 1,000 humans in her lifetime, and you will be 1,001. Marcus did not respond to their taunts. He simply sat in silence and thought about Sithara and Velketh, and hoped that they at least were being treated well. After what felt like an eternity, the ship finally arrived at Valkathos, the Chiron throne world. Marcus was hauled out of his cell and marched through the streets of the capital city in chains, while crowds of Chiron gathered to watch and jeer. He had never seen so many of them in one place, and the sight was overwhelming. The Chiron were tall and insectoid with gleaming carapaces that ranged in color from deep blue to brilliant gold. Their compound eyes followed him with hatred, and their mandibles clicked with sounds that he knew were insults, even if he could not understand the words. The royal palace was the largest structure Marcus had ever seen, and it was built from the hulls of conquered ships that had been fused together into a monument of victory. Walking through those halls, he saw the preserved remains of 100 different species, and he wondered if his own bones would soon join the collection. The throne room was vast and dark, with only a few shafts of light cutting through the shadows from high windows. Thousands of cairn filled the chamber, and they parted like water as Marcus was dragged toward the throne, and there sitting, upon a seat of carved chitin and ancient metal, was Queen Siltherex herself. She was enormous and ancient and terrifying. Her carapace was scarred from countless battles, and her blade arms could have cut Marcus in half without effort, but it was her eyes that made him truly afraid. Those compound eyes held a coldness that went beyond hatred and into something older and darker and more absolute. "Bring the human forward," she commanded, and her voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. The guards threw Marcus to the floor at her feet, and he felt the impact jar through his already battered body. "So this is the creature that my warriors found," the queen said with contempt. "This small soft thing is what humans send against us." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but the queen did not smile. "Do you know who I am, human?" she asked Marcus, lifted his head, and looked directly into her eyes. "You are Queen Siltherex," he said, and his voice was steady despite his fear, "ruler of the Chiron Dominion, and mother to Princess Cythara and Princess Velketh." The mention of her daughters made something flicker in the queen's ancient eyes, but it was gone before Marcus could identify it. "My daughters are dead," she said coldly, "killed when your ship was destroyed by forces unknown to us." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. She did not know, somehow. In the chaos of the patrol ship, the news had not reached her. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "your daughters are not dead." The queen rose from her throne, and her massive form loomed over Marcus like a mountain about to fall. "You dare lie to me," she hissed. "You dare give me false hope as some pathetic attempt to save your worthless life." "I am not lying," Marcus said firmly. "I saved them from the Harbinger before it was destroyed, and I kept them alive for 40 days in an escape pod, and they were with me when your patrol found us." The queen's blade arms twitched, and for a moment Marcus thought she was going to kill him right there. Then she turned to her guards. "Bring me the truth," she commanded. Now, one of the guards rushed out of the chamber, and the entire throne room fell into tense silence. Minutes passed that felt like hours then. The great doors at the far end of the chamber swung open, and two small figures walked through. Cythera held her sister's hand, and they walked with their heads high despite the thousands of eyes watching them. They were cleaned and groomed and dressed in royal garments, but their eyes were fixed on only one thing: the broken human kneeling at their mother's feet. "Mother," Cythera called out, and her voice carried across the vast chamber. "This human speaks the truth, and he saved our lives." The queen descended from her throne and moved toward her daughters with a speed that belied her massive size. She stopped just before reaching them, and her ancient body trembled with emotions that Marcus could not read. "You are alive," she whispered, and for the first time her voice held something other than cold authority. "You are both alive because of him," Cythera said, pointing at Marcus. "He found us on the burning ship, and he carried us to safety, and he gave us his food and his warmth when we had nothing, and he did this knowing that we were Chiron and he was human." The queen turned to look at Marcus, and her compound eyes studied him as if seeing him for the first time around. The throne room, the royal guards still held their plasma lances aimed at his chest, but now there was uncertainty in their postures. "He saved the daughters of your enemy," Cythera continued, and she left her sister's side to stand next to Marcus. He did not have to do this, and he knew he would probably die for it, but he did it anyway. Queen Siltherex stared at her daughter, and then at the human kneeling on the cold floor. The guards waited for her command with weapons ready. One word from her, and Marcus would be ash. But that word did not come. Instead, the great queen of the Chiron Dominion did something that no one in that chamber had ever seen before. She faltered, and in that moment of hesitation, Marcus saw something he had never expected to find in those ancient alien eyes. He saw a mother who had thought her children were lost forever, and he saw that mother looking at the impossible creature who had brought them home. The silence in the throne room stretched on and on until it became a living thing pressing down on everyone. Present Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears as he watched the queen struggle with something she had never faced before her. Guards still held their weapons ready, but they would not fire without her command, and that command was not coming. "This changes nothing," one of the advisors finally spoke up from the shadows beside the throne. "He is human, and humans are our enemies. And the law is clear about what must be done with enemies captured in war." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "The advisor speaks truth," another voice called out. "The princesses are safe, and we are grateful, but gratitude does not erase 1,000 years of conflict between our peoples. Kill him and be done with it," a warrior shouted from somewhere in the back. "His kind slaughtered our colonies in the Outer Rim, and this one life cannot pay for those crimes." Queen Silphirax raised one blade arm, and the voices fell silent immediately. She had not taken her eyes off Marcus since her daughters had walked through those doors, and her expression remained unreadable behind the hard planes of her ancient carapace. "You," she said, pointing at Marcus, "stand." It took all of his remaining strength, but Marcus forced himself to his feet and stood before the most powerful being in the Kyra Dominion. He was bruised and bloody and half-starved, but he stood straight and met her gaze without flinching. "My advisors counsel death," the queen said. "My warriors demand blood, and my people cry out for vengeance against your kind." She took a step closer, and Marcus could feel the heat radiating from her massive body. "Give me one reason why I should deny them," she said. Marcus thought about all the things he could say in this moment. Could beg for mercy, but that would only confirm what the Karen believed about human weakness. He could threaten retaliation, but that would be an empty threat from a man in chains. He could try to bargain, but he had nothing to offer that the queen did not already possess, so instead he told her the truth. "I cannot give you a reason," he said, and his voice carried across the silent chamber. "I cannot offer you anything that would balance the scales between our peoples or undo the harm that has been done on both sides." The crowd stirred with surprise at his words, and even the queen seemed caught off guard by his honesty. "Then why should I spare you?" she asked. Marcus looked past the queen to where Sithara and Velketh stood watching with wide, frightened eyes. "You should not spare me for my sake," he said. "I do not ask for my life, because I think I deserve to live, and I do not claim that. Saving your daughters makes me special or heroic." He returned his gaze to the queen. "I did what I did, because that is what humans do," he said. "We protect children, and it does not matter whose children they are, or what flag their parents serve, or what wars their people have fought." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "When I found your daughters on that burning ship, I did not see care on our enemies or bargaining chips," he said. "I saw two scared children who were going to die if someone did not help them." He took a breath and pressed on. "I gave them my food because they were hungry, and I gave them my warmth because they were cold, and I held them through the long nights when they cried for their mother." Tears were streaming down Velka's face now, and even Sithra's composure was cracking. I am not asking you to spare me," Marcus said quietly. "I am asking you to understand something about my people before you decide to go to war with them." The queen tilted her great head. "And what would you have me understand?" she asked. "That we are not what you think we are," Marcus replied. "Your advisors call us weak because we value mercy over strength, and your warriors call us soft because we will sacrifice ourselves for strangers." He gestured at his broken body with his chained hands. "Look at me," he said. "I am small and fragile, and I have no claws or armor or blade arms to defend myself with." He lifted his chin with quiet pride. "But I kept your daughters alive for 40 days, with nothing but my bare hands and my stubborn human heart, and I did it knowing that the reward for my efforts would probably be death." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. That is not weakness, your majesty, and that is not softness either. The throne room was utterly silent. Now even the advisors who had called for his death seemed struck by his words. Queen Siltherax studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see ancient thoughts moving behind her compound eyes. My mother told me stories. When I was young, she said finally, stories about a time before the wars when Chiron still remembered what it meant to show mercy. She looked at her daughters. We have forgotten those stories, she continued. We have become so focused on strength and conquest that we lost sight of the virtues that once made us great. She turned back to Marcus. You have shown my daughters something that I could not teach them, she said. You have shown them that true courage is not the willingness to kill, but the willingness to sacrifice. The queen spoke a single word in ancient, Chiron Valsathir. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every Chiron in the chamber dropped to one knee, including the royal guards, and their weapons clattered to the floor. Cythara gasped and covered her mouth with both claws. Mother, she breathed. Do you know what you are saying? I know exactly what I'm saying, the queen replied, and she reached out to touch Marcus's face with surprising gentleness. This human is Valsathir, and he is soul bonded to the royal house by a debt that can never be repaid. She raised her voice so that all could hear. From this day forward, let it be known that the human called Marcus Cole is under the protection of the throne, she declared. Any who harm him will face the full wrath of the Dominion, and any who question his honor will answer to me personally. The crowd remained kneeling in stunned silence. Marcus felt his legs give out beneath him, and he would have fallen if Cythara had not rushed forward to catch him. You did it, she whispered in his ear. You actually did it. Marcus tried to smile, but his vision was going dark around the edges. I think I need to sit down, he mumbled, the last thing he saw before consciousness. Faded was Queen Siltherax looking down at him with something that might have been respect, and in that moment he knew that everything had changed, not just for him, but for both their peoples. The war that everyone had expected never came, and instead something far more remarkable happened. 3 months after Marcus Cole stood before the Queen of the Chiron Dominion, a human diplomatic ship arrived at Velkathos carrying a new ambassador and a message of peace. The humans had expected to negotiate from a position of weakness, and they had prepared themselves for humiliation and harsh terms. Instead, they found Queen Siltherax waiting for them with an offer that shocked the entire galaxy. She wanted Marcus Cole to serve as the permanent human ambassador to the Chiron throne world. The human government did not know what to make of this request, and they sent message after message asking Marcus to explain what had happened. He told them the truth as simply as he could. He had saved 2 children, and doing so, he had changed the mind of a queen. It was not a complicated story, but it was a powerful one, and word of it spread across both human and Chiron space like wildfire. Marcus accepted the position of ambassador because he could not think of a good reason to refuse. He had no family waiting for him back on Earth, and no home to return to after the destruction of the Harbinger, and somewhere along the way the 2 young princesses he had saved had become the closest thing to family he had left. The first years were difficult in ways that Marcus had not anticipated. Chiron was still suspicious of humans, and many of them resented the Queen's decision to honor one of their enemies. There were assassination attempts and political schemes and endless negotiations that seemed to go nowhere. But Marcus was patient and stubborn in the way that only humans could be. He learned the Chiron language until he could speak it as fluently as any native. He studied their customs and traditions and history until he understood them better than most. Chiron did themselves. He attended their festivals and mourned at their funerals and celebrated at their victories and slowly won. Day at a time, he began to change the way they saw his people. Cythara was his greatest ally in this work. She had grown from a frightened child into a confident young leader, and she used her position as princes to advocate for peace at every opportunity. She told the story of Marcus Cole to anyone who would listen, and she challenged the old beliefs about human weakness with the evidence of his actions. He was cold and hungry and afraid, she would say, but he gave us everything he had because that is what humans do. Velketh grew up quieter than her sister, but her influence was no less profound. She became a scholar and historian, and she dedicated her life to documenting the relationship between humans and Chiron. Her writings would eventually become required reading in schools across the Dominion, and generations of young Chiron would learn about the human who saved their princesses. Queen Siltherax lived for another 50 years after that day in the throne room, and she spent those years transforming the Dominion in ways that no one had thought possible. She opened trade routes with human worlds and established cultural exchange programs, and even allowed human families to settle on Chiron planets for the first time in history. Not everyone approved of these changes, and there were many who whispered that the queen had grown soft in her old age, but those whispers never grew into anything more, because the queen's authority remained absolute, and her commitment to the new path never wavered. When she finally passed into the Great Silence, her last words were spoken to Marcus, who had been summoned to her bedside. "I was wrong about your kind," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I thought mercy was weakness, but you showed me that it is the greatest strength of all." Marcus held her massive claw in his small human hands. "You gave me a chance when no one else would," he said. "You could have killed me, and no one would have blamed you for it." The ancient queen made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I almost did," she admitted. "But then I looked at my daughters, and I saw how they looked at you, and I knew that killing you would destroy something precious in them." She closed her compound eyes. "You taught them to hope," she said, "and through them you taught me as well." She died with her claws still wrapped around his hands. Marcus Cole served as ambassador for 30 more years after the queen's passing, and he watched as Sithara took the throne and continued her mother's work. The alliance between humans and Chiron grew stronger with each passing decade, and old hatreds faded into memory as new generations grew up knowing only peace. Marcus never married, and he never had children of his own, but he did not feel that he had missed out on anything. He had been given something more rare and precious than a family of his own. Had been given the chance to build a bridge between two worlds. When Marcus finally died at the age of 93, he was surrounded by those who loved him. Scythar and Velketh were there along with their own children and grandchildren and representatives from a dozen human worlds who had come to pay their respects. The funeral was held in the great throne room where Marcus had once knelt in chains waiting to die, but now the room was filled with mourners from both species, and the sound of their grief echoed off walls that had once known only war. Buried him in the Hall of Heroes alongside the greatest warriors in Chiron history. His memorial was made from human steel rather than Chiron chitin, but it stood just as tall and proud as any other. Inscription was written in both languages so that anyone from either world could read it. Here rests Marcus Cole, who taught the Dominion that true strength is not in the blade that kills, but in the hand that shields. He was human. He was enough. In the centuries that followed, the story of Marcus Cole became legend. Children on human worlds and Chiron worlds alike grew up hearing about the soldier who chose mercy over vengeance and changed the course of history. They learned that humans were small and soft, and lived such brief flickering lives that a Chiron could know a dozen human generations in their own lifetime. They also learned that these small soft creatures would walk through fire for a stranger. They would starve themselves to feed an enemy child. They would face certain death with quiet dignity and never ask for anything in return. And that was what made them dangerous. That was what made them worthy. That was what made them human.